Hello everyone and welcome to the second session of day 2 of the inaugural CBAN showcase. Thank you to everyone who's joining us and thank you especially to our speakers for this session. As with our other sessions, please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. These will be answered throughout the conversation and at the end of the session if there's any time for any more. We're also encouraging you to share extensively on social media using the hashtag CBAN Showcase. And with that, I'll hand over to Joe, the CTO of CBAN, who is moderating this session.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elena. And I would like to welcome everybody and especially our distinguished panelists to this session on working together to support the industry. If we could advance to the next slide. As Louisa already announced yesterday and mentioned in her keynote, the CBAN is already cooperating in different ways with a number of groups in our industry. We are already well underway with agreements to work together with the GSMA, the TM Forum, the MEF, and MOBI. And we're going to hear a lot more from MOBI in a session after this, but I am fortunate to have representatives from the GSMA, Gautam Hazari, the TM Forum, Dave Millam, and the MEF, Daniel Barlev, here to discuss now how our organizations can work together based on what we've learned already and what we see as the road ahead. Could we go to the next slide, please? So these four organizations that I mentioned, the GSMA, heavily focused on mobile, obviously, and mobile roaming. The TM Forum, which has been the place for telco industry, BSS and OSS for decades now. The MEF, which defined carrier Ethernet and has been following that section of the industry through SD-WAN and data on demand services, all have projects that are looking at settlement for their members. And in fact, many of the members of these organizations are members of the other organizations. We tend to see each other at the same meetings. And when we start to look about the future going forward, the work that we're doing in our various vertical markets starts to converge. And if we could go to the next slide, please. There is a point where all of them are wanting to settle with other members and members of adjacent organizations like MOBI in the case of our discussion now. And we see that intersection as really being where the CBAN fits. And so that's what I wanted to have a discussion about now. And I thought I would start, Dave, with you because, as I mentioned, the TM Forum has been in the BSS and OSS business for a while, and you've learned a lot in that time. And I was wondering if you could give us some thoughts and perspective about automation in the industry and automation for collaboration. What have we learned there up to this point that might be relevant for us now?
Yes, thank you very much, Joe. So my history is I worked in BT before I joined the TM Forum. And one of my last tasks was actually doing B2B interconnect with BT in the UK industry activities. And I picked up some of that work earlier on in the TM Forum around about 2014 on B2B to X and business models and those sorts of things. And we produced some recommendations on processes. Over time, things have evolved and the technology gets better. And those recommendations have evolved towards our open APIs, which are REST-based APIs. But obviously settlements are an important part of this, which is the starting point for your presentation. And we do have, in fact, some of our members in our catalysts or our innovation activities that are putting together demonstrations. Actually, over this period of time, there are some demonstrations, particularly around the use of distributed ledger technology. From my own personal experience, settlements as a process between operators is a very fraught process and subject to many complexities, disputes, differences of opinions about how things are measured, different standards for measuring things in different companies. And it is a very protracted and difficult process, which definitely needs some further investigation, and DLT technology looks to be a very interesting opportunity.
Probably helps if I unmute. And Gautam, from a GSMA perspective, do you have any historical motivational learnings that you think are relevant here?
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Joe. So within GSMA, roaming settlement has been one of the critical pieces, as we all know. I mean, that's where GSMA got created in the first place. Automation has been one of the key aspects that we all have been looking into for optimization, for cost saving, for efficiency, because that drives a lot of cost and complexities. Recently, we have been looking into the DLT technologies in the context of automation, and also automation when there are integration involved as well, because automation can be done. And within GSMA, we have been done automation, and currently it's been done in the mobile industry, at least using centralized tools. But now we are looking into applying the DLT technologies so that we can do the automation of settlements, of usage calculations, of contract exchanges in a distributed fashion, so that the integration cost to the automation mechanism can be reduced, and also the security, privacy, and also in the post-GDPR era, which becomes much more important. All these are taken care of. And currently we are actually doing a pilot across some leading mobile operators. It's still ongoing, and then maybe later when we have the result of the pilot, we can share that. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you. And so with that background, you see, it was the GLF that actually kicked off what became CBAN, and I was wondering if you'd be able to expound a bit on what the idea was, what the commercial opportunities or pressures were, and how that fit into everything.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Joe. So GLF kicked off the working group originally called just Blockchain Applications in Telecoms, with a view to see what are the potential opportunities to automate, very clearly, to automate some of these clumsy business processes that exist among carriers in the first instance. The GLF represents the commercial executives leadership of the international carrier community. And obviously one of the key points in that regard is interoperability. So, and it's not just a technical interoperability, but also commercial interoperability, in the sense that as we are designing and making network innovations, product innovations, the whole concept and the whole foundation of the industry is based upon different carriers being able to interoperate and this way connect all the networks across the world. But a lot of times it's the settlement side and actually the commercial interactions between the carriers that can be the problem. And it's especially in the case of if you're looking at new network innovations. And this really, what it does, it adds friction. And what the GLF always tried to do is that how can we create and enable this much more to create this sort of frictionless commerce. So as a result, there was a number of testing that went through in terms of POC, looking at whether the technology can facilitate this. It can, very clearly. So it was very early on, it became apparent that one of the key things is not just in terms of trying to figure out what the technology should be and how that is implemented, but then also how do we as an industry govern this? How do we set up the governance framework? Because our members also saw that it has implication not just beyond, not just within the inter-carrier environment, but actually across the whole ICT service provider community, across the whole infrastructure, service providers, applications. So we start to look at ways that how can we create and how can we future-proof this governance framework that will allow all parts of the ecosystem to participate, facilitating, enabling all types of current and future use cases to be run on a platform. What kind of a framework do we need to put in place? What kind of facilities we need to put in place to ensure that the technology is developed in the right way? Ultimately, it's a sort of very simplistic. We can say it's not about, we don't really necessarily care what standards we use, as long as everybody uses the same standard, and we all agree to that, which then can create us with an interoperable environment, which was also, create us ability to better serve our customers and innovate with new products and services.
Thank you. So that is a good example of the motivation and the promised land we want to get to. But thinking about how we're going to get there, Daniel, I'd like to bring you in. Because I know the MEF has done some very pragmatic work on evolutionary approaches. And I was wondering if you would like to tell us a bit about that.
Thank you, Joe. So MEF, MEF Forum, for those that are less familiar with MEF, we're focused on data services as a standards forum. And we have over 120 service provider members that are going to be very, very interested in what's being promoted by GLF and CBAN. But what we need to do is to make that work, bring that into MEF and make it as relevant as possible and as feasible as possible for our members and demonstrate how to do that. And what we're seeing is that there's an overall trend among our members to introduce more and more dynamic, complex data services that rely on supply chains that are longer than 2 or 3 players, but will eventually grow longer and more complex. And obviously this needs to be supported with billing and settlement. That's a very, very fundamental issue for our members and for reducing the commercial friction that you see and you mentioned earlier. So what we have to show them is a sort of a step-by-step approach to achieving that. And so what we've done is we've introduced a concept which we call smart bilaterals, where essentially we're saying to our members, to our service provider members, your buyers and sellers, you're buying and selling from each other. You already have commercial arrangements between you underpinned by MSAs. Now let's show you, if you add to what you already have, your traditional, more manual-oriented processes, if you add in DLT as being described by CBAN, then you can start achieving some very important benefits, not just operational benefits, but you can start supporting new services, complex, high-value services. For example, SASE services that are coming in that require highly deployable, agile security functions and network functions, being able to even just change bandwidth along supply chain. In order to be able to do that, really, that requires DLT and it requires these smart bilaterals. But they don't want to take out what they've already got. They don't want to break or replace what they've got, obviously. And so what we're working on now is standards and what we call proofs of concept, prototyping, where we can introduce DLTs on a bilateral basis between our members, they can start introducing this and using that as a first step towards that greater vision of more complex services, longer supply chains.
So so it sounds like a very considered approach where to ease the transition, you're not replacing everything wholesale necessarily, not requiring big changes, but an evolutionary approach where you bring automation into an existing process, create a platform, and build and transform over time. Is that fair?
Absolutely, yes.
So thank you. And Gautam, you also had some thoughts, I know, about moving. Daniel described a very good starting point and way to proceed. I think you have some ideas about eventually moving beyond just two parties. From the GSMA perspective, would you like to tell us about that?
Absolutely. Thanks, Joe. So as Daniel was mentioning, this smart bilateral, that's a good starting point, because one of the challenges that happens in getting bootstrapped into this new way of integrating, new way of participating in this supply chain, especially for settlement, is the network effect is important. You're not just doing, so one entity is not just doing business with another entity, it's doing in a many-to-many relationship. So in that case, if not everyone is participating, in that case, the entity who is jumping into this new DLT-based technologies, they will have to maintain two different systems, and that's expensive, and that adds to the complexity. We cannot probably avoid that, but when you want to start, you can start with the smart bilateral, as Daniel was mentioning, but then you will have to scale it up. You will have to scale it up to all the relationships that you have. And there are some technological challenges that comes into the picture. This is what we have experienced within GSMA in some of the pilots that we are working on. So most of the DLT platforms, they now provide mechanisms to do those bilateral relationships, whether it is private channel, or you can create some sort of private ledger between two entities. So one of the things on the scalability is the amount of resources, technical resources on the DLT that will be needed. So for example, each bilateral relationship is almost like a private ledger. So then if you have, for example, in the mobile world, if you have 800 such relationships, so you multiply that ledger with 800. So you cannot really practically easily maintain 800 ledgers. So in that case, there are other mechanisms which needs to be looked into. One of the patterns that we have seen is useful is to balance between off-chain and on-chain communication. So the ledgers are extremely good for security management, integrity management. So we have introduced a concept of smart notarization. So if any private information, whether it's a contract or any usage information, if that needs to be shared off ledger or off chain, you can actually notarize that data through the DLT. In that case, you can scale it up because that notarization doesn't contain or doesn't consume a lot of resources. And at the same time, here you can actually very easily go beyond the next entity. You can scale it up gradually, but you can scale it up without a need to again go back to the drawing board.
Great. And you mentioned network effects there, and I'm thinking this might be a good point to pivot to talk about some of the definite benefits of using DLT and automation in general. And Jussi, I was wondering if you have any thoughts from the GLF perspective about network effects in general and the benefits of making this approach and this technology more ubiquitous, or towards ubiquity in our ecosystem.
Well, absolutely. I think clearly this is one of these things that in order for blockchain or any kind of distributed ledger, it needs to be, the network needs to be distributed, it needs to have members in the network. This is not something that anyone can do on their own. No one can do on their own. So as a result, that kind of coordination, that kind of a sense of direction to the whole industry is very, very vital on that. There's a question, obviously, on a blockchain, you use it on circumstances where you need to use it, where it actually brings the benefits over and beyond the technical complexities perhaps that it will add. But that's why it's even more critical that there is going to be this not maintaining different types of architectures, but try to have a single one, try to ensure that you consolidate as much as possible, not just members in the network, but also the different types of use cases they can do, because obviously there's also going to be the question of integrating that into your own system. So the fewer types there is and the more users there are, clearly the benefits will be maximized, and while the additional cost will become more and more marginal on that. But it's a fundamentally key thing here, is not just on the technology development, but also the whole network and development of the community.
And that's a very good point. I had just last week the CBAN representative of one of the large European groups pointed out to me that they may settle with a certain set of partners for mobile, but a very similar set of partners they settle with for voice, and they will for data in the future. And they don't want to have a platform for each one. They would like to have one uniform platform for settling with everything.
Absolutely, and adding and integrating that with your internal accounting systems and revenue assurance systems and various other things. So you could just imagine the complexity that you don't want to have on multiple different systems running.
And so that is a major benefit of using DLT. There also, I think, in our different organizations, we've seen some smaller effects, but still significant ones. I think, Daniel, you had discovered at the MEF that there's actually increased credibility with invoices when DLT is used. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Actually, there are two examples. I'll give a slightly different example for the first one, and then I'll elaborate on what you just mentioned.
Okay.
And actually, there's a very important point here to give context to these two examples. We tend to have involved more technology-oriented people in our organizations, and what's really important is to bring in the commercial people as well, because the benefits are really going to be enjoyed by the commercial people. And quite often, the more technology-oriented people aren't aware of what the possible benefits are. I'll give you two examples. One is, while we're working through the draft document that we're working on at the moment, one of the contributors pointed out that every time there's a bandwidth a request from the customer, the buyer, to increase the bandwidth, for example, using DLT, you won't need to reissue an order, because typically the processes of service providers require that, okay, I want to increase the bandwidth. Now I need to get another quote. I need to place another order. I have to go through that process. Whereas with DLT, you can do something far more agile and simply cut out that reorder step and just record the fact that the bandwidth changed, and the billing and settlement can rely on what's recorded in that synchronized state. Another example, which is much more commercially oriented, is the fact that when you're, and we highlighted this in a white paper that was co-authored by Andreas Freund from QLC Chain, who was on the previous session. When you start generating invoices using smart contracts on the DLT, those invoices become more credible. And many organizations, many service providers do actually do what's called invoice financing, because they're actually invoicing 60 to 90 days, they're in effect loaning money to their customer. And so they want to borrow against that in order to have revenue financing. And so there's this thing called invoice financing, and the more credible your invoices are, the better the rates you can get on finance that you raise against those invoices. So these are just two examples that are starting to become more apparent during the discussion on this work. And I think it highlights the importance of bringing more and more commercial people into the framework, and CBAN and GLF are doing a fantastic job on that. And we need to follow suit in MEF, and I'm sure that it applies to other partners of CBAN.
Great, thank you, Daniel. We're going to come back to that point, your last point there, in just a little bit. But to get there, I'd like to ask the panel a little bit about their experience with inhibitors, inhibitors to progress, inhibitors to innovation, maybe even myths about blockchain, which have produced some of those, which we need to overcome together. And I know, Gautam, you had a few examples, so I might start with you and then move on to Dave for the BSS in general perspective. But Gautam, first, what have you seen as inhibitors that we need to get over, or myths that we need to combat from your perspective at the GSMA?
Thanks, Joe. So as I started to talk about earlier as well, is privacy. So one of the concerns that you always hear, and almost like a blocker to get into or get the full potential of blockchain, is privacy. And in the post GDPR world, it becomes even more important. One of the things that we hear a lot is, for example, is the Article 17 of GDPR, so right to be forgotten, and anything that goes into a DLT is always present. Are they not contradicting each other? And then that creates confusion, and then that creates the inhibitor, as we were talking about. But it's probably the way you look into. You don't have to put every data within the blockchain or in the DLT. DLT is an excellent technology in doing something distributively. It's not really just a database. So as I was talking about earlier, the balance between off-chain and on-chain. So the mechanism that we have looked into is basically using the DLT for privacy managed data, so that all those concerns of that privacy and blockchain, they don't go hand in hand, and all the GDPR concerns are there. So they can be resolved from technological solutions which are available right now. So many of the DLT platforms, they provide zero knowledge protocols. They provide private channels, for example. They provide private data collection, and also balancing out with the off-chain communication of very sensitive data, which doesn't have to go to the DLT, because DLT is not really a database, can actually remove all those barriers, which are mostly conceptual barriers and mental barriers.
Thank you. And Dave, from your longer term perspective, not with blockchain, but with BSS and projects that have been inspired by the TM Forum's initiatives, do you have any thoughts about what can inhibit change and things that we could get out ahead of to remove obstacles proactively?
You're on mute, Dave.
Sorry, I had an airplane going over.
And you're back.
I'm back. Okay. So yes, the main concerns, I think, are really on the business side, getting the business people bought into this. I'm sure most of the technological problems, the scaling, the on-off chain stuff can be sorted. But typical things I've seen in the past, particularly around settlements, and bear in mind that typically operators send bills to each other and then pay the difference. So it's not quite like invoicing. One of the major concerns with any kind of billing system is an understanding about auditability and accuracy of records, from the point of view of the finance director. So there'll be lots of barriers and educational requirements, I think, around educating the finance directors in terms of satisfying their requirements that the records they're seeing from their systems represent an accurate position of where the business is on a day-by-day basis. And I think that's often overlooked in these discussions. It's seen as purely a technical issue. But these are around cash flow, outflows, inflows, all those things being balanced off. And I think there'll be an auditability requirement. Most billing systems in operators are audited in some way, and they have very high controls over changes to those systems. So as soon as you externalize some parts of this in a way that's unfamiliar, you're going to run into some issues about demonstrating that the end-to-end integrity and auditability of the chain of these bills and these items is actually all in place. And obviously DLT is definitely part of the solution to that. What I have noticed from the sort of, say, a decade or so ago, where interconnect on a bilateral basis was of interest, is that most of the Catalyst projects, implementation projects we've run over the last decade in this space, have largely been looking at like vertical industry type services, which involve multiple parties. And it becomes pretty obvious that you need two things. One is a multi-party approach to doing settlements and exchange of revenue. And you also need to develop some kind of patterns for how you do revenue flows. And this starts to introduce things like agents, intermediaries, factorers, factorization type things, which Daniel mentioned earlier. And I think sort of lack of familiarity with those kinds of business models as we develop these kinds of things, particularly beyond the bilateral. And that's what we've seen in a lot of the catalysts over the last 10 years, and also in the current catalysts, even things where we're using DLT for trading of 5G access, slice access, which is the most recent catalyst. You still see issues about, fundamentally, we need to understand the business models and have absolute assurance that the settlement processes actually have the integrity and the auditability and are providing finance directors with accurate, up-to-date, day-to-day figures, basically.
Thank you, Dave. And Daniel, you sort of answered this already by talking about the evolutionary approach as a proactive way to avoid inhibitors. But specifically in the MEF experience or the MEF community experience, are there any things that we as an industry and as industry groups can do to help to proactively remove inhibitors?
Well, I can tell you what we're doing at MEF, and then we can see, discuss if that's relevant for others. First of all, we are very pleased to have CBAN as a member in MEF. We think that's very important for collaboration, cooperation, and alignment. So that's certainly a first practical step. But there are four planes that we're operating on in terms of overcoming these inhibitors and getting adoption among our members and hopefully seeding wider adoption in the industry. One is standards, one is implementation, one is certification, and one is education. So on the standardization front, we just last week, the membership approved the first DLT-oriented standards project. It's referred to as MEF W114. It's focused on inter-operator, inter-service provider automation, billing and settlement using DLT and providing a framework for that. That is going to be the first in a series of standards. We've sort of focused on billing and settlement, but we intend to apply that to other parts of the service life cycle. So standardization, we've already taken that practical first step. And that standard that we're working on is actually derived from CBAN work that was mentioned earlier by Shahar, the MVP data on demand. So very, very close alignment and thinking there. And as I said, that's just the start. The second one is implementation. It's very important to get our service provider members to actually start implementing DLT. So we have 2 POCs in play where we have champions in our members that are very active in our. I'm sorry, are very active in our work, and they have to go into their organizations and get other departments to buy in, and the only way you can do that is with implementation projects. That's our experience. So that's the second one. The third one is you need to validate. I mean, somebody says that they're doing it the way that it's described in the standards. Well, we have to give the tools to the industry in order to verify, so that they give credibility and confidence of their partners that they're implementing the way that the standards describe the implementation. And the fourth, and perhaps this is the most important to overcome the initial inhibitors, is educate, educate, educate. There are a lot of very, very interested people, but this is new for them. And what we've seen, and as I mentioned, the white paper that we put out, that's just the first one. We need to explain these things over and over again in simple ways, and focus on different aspects, so that our members and the industry as a whole can grapple with this and start implementing it and adopting it.
Great, thanks, Daniel. And you mentioned standards there, not unreasonably, and I might want to ask Jussi from your perspective. I'm guessing that you would think a standards war is not a good idea. Would you think that your members would support, or how would they support us converging to avoid one?
Well, absolutely, and perhaps one of the original ideas also behind the work to create CBAN is to create a way of avoiding that as much as possible, in a way that how can we orchestrate, how can we can coordinate, how can we can bring everything together that we can avoid this sort of a standards war. And clearly there's maybe three reasons why that would be a bad, because firstly, no one will benefit out of this. This is if there is not if there are not similar or same standards on which everybody uses, what you cannot achieve is interoperability. Without interoperability, what you can't achieve is the ability to offer services across the whole global footprint. Ultimately, it will also be the consumers who will suffer in the sense that they are not able to access the services. Services are not available to them. That is enabled by technology, but simply because an industry cannot figure out in best way how to standardize that. The other, of course, is going to be cost. So there's going to be cost not just in terms of the lost opportunities, because you don't have the interoperability, but then there's potentially also the additional cost for having to maintain different non-interoperable systems again. So it's absolutely vital that we try and figure out as early as possible a way to move forward and not have these multiple standards wars going forward.
So I would like to think that what we're doing here and what we're doing at the CBAN is a good way to coordinate the standards work of all these different bodies, because everybody is trying to help their members do the same thing. And to use one of my favorite quotes from Daniele Mancuso of Sparkle, if we all reinvent the wheel, we'll have a garage full of wheels and no car. So I see the CBAN as the place where we can come together and everybody can get their toolkits out, and instead of building a bunch of wheels, we can work together and actually build a good vehicle. And I guess I would like to ask, and maybe Jussi, I'll go back to you and start with you, but then I'd like to ask all of our panelists, what are your thoughts on what we don't want to happen? So in other words, if we can't do that, if we can't manage to pool our resources and our brain power and work together, well, what's the future that we face? The counterfactual. If we don't manage to do this, then what happens? And Jussi, maybe I'll start with you and then ask the others for their thoughts on that as well.
Sure, absolutely. I think that obviously there's going to be, from a business perspective, there's going to be a much more limited ability to really innovate around the new technologies around. So, you know, all of the opportunities that 5G, for instance, warrants, you know, the key ICT service providers, the infrastructure providers are not necessarily able to participate in that additional value increase, if indeed such value is even created. What you end up risking is perhaps that you will see a world with a very few but large closed garden ecosystems, and where we are not going to have the concept of ubiquitous connectivity or interoperability available. So you will have, you know, the few and the rich will have access to much more of a better amount, you know, breadth, scale, different type, you know, options for different types of services, which are not then available elsewhere in the world, because, you know, it might be under a different closed garden ecosystem. So, you know, if you know, clearly there's going to be, you know, there's going to be risks to the, you know, existing business model of basically, you know, everybody's involved, and ultimately it's the ability for having more players, existing and new players, to participate in innovating for new services.
So, Dr. Ham, would you want to add anything to that from the GSMA perspective, or yours?
Yeah, I mean, just adding on to what Yussi was saying, is one of the things is about interoperability. Interoperability is expensive, depending on when you start to think about that. If you start to think about interoperability after the implementation and deployment is done, it's very expensive and it's complex, right? And that's not a problem that you want to solve, because at that time you want to solve the business problems, not really the interoperability problem. So that's why it's important to talk about interoperability at the start, at the initial phase, so that you don't end up in a situation where instead of solving business problems, you need to look into how do you become interoperable.
I think that is an excellent point. And, you know, it's not free to think about it as a design consideration at the start, but a little investment now when we are designing for interoperability can save a whole lot of pain and lost opportunity later on if we attempt to retrofit it. So I think that is really a great motivator for us to be working together as organizations. Dave, would you like to add anything from your perspective on that?
I was going to say, yeah, obviously the greatest extent to which you can get standardization achieved makes a lot of sense, and I think it comes down to practical issues. In the end, you know, specific business problems that you can solve, and availability of suitable technologies. So, for example, in the work that we did in BT some years ago, we went with something called EBXML. And the reason for that was the availability of the technology to the participating organizations, which were largely UK telecoms companies. There were open source implementations, there were commercial implementations of that technology. But that only gave you the basic interoperability, to come back to the earlier point from Gautam, that on top of those basic interoperability capabilities, you still had to add what kinds of orders, what kinds of trouble tickets you were trying to exchange. And those also had to be specialized for specific services. So when we look at this standardization, it's very easy to just say, well, standardize everything. But actually, some things need to be standardized first. Then you need to allow for some areas of differentiation because the requirements that people have are different. And a good example of this is between the TM Forum and the MEF, where we're using basically the same APIs, but the MEF has different payload in them to support the specific services and technologies that they want to do. So that gives you a basic level of interoperability, but it doesn't mean that the interfaces are exactly the same in totality. It means they share common properties which have some benefits. One is the point that was made earlier about multiple implementations are basically impossible to support. In fact, that discussion has happened both in the MEF and in the TM Forum. But when you look at implementing these things, you can't really afford to build lots and lots of interfaces. And I have a number of war stories from BT, which I'll just say you can get through an awful lot of money quite quickly with not thinking these things through at the start, basically. But I would say that, you know, obviously it makes sense, but the thing that makes sense is to actually drive this by some common needs across the industry, so people are aligned on what they're trying to achieve in the short run, just as Daniel identified with, say, for example, MEF type services. Our interests are around 5G and some of the what we call beyond connectivity services aimed at industry verticals, which naturally involve multiple parties. So I think, yes, standards are really important. You don't particularly want a standards war, but do understand that there will be needs for different organisations to add their own specific extensions to base standards, because that's the problem that they've got that they need to solve.
Of course. And speaking of needs, I'm afraid we need to wrap this discussion up because we're out of time. But this was a really very productive and somewhat exhilarating exchange of ideas, and I think discovery of common ground amongst our organizations. So that's fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for participating on the panel and in the audience. And Elena, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks again to everybody for participating in this session. Please do join us for our next session, which will start in 15 minutes, which is the Automating Data Transfer for Mobility Services session. Finally, please do continue to share extensively on social media using the hashtag CBAN Showcase, and I look forward to seeing you all in 15 minutes for the next session. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.